We are joined once again by Professor Salim Mansur. Good day, Salim.
Uh, Good morning. Good day, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. Now, our previous discussion dealt with the genesis of neoconservatism and the key U.S. foreign policy wonks who created it. We continue our discussion today of neoconservatism by focusing on the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC, a think tank founded in 1997 by neocons William Crystal and Robert Kagan. It had such notable members as Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and Jeb Bush. Now, I will read from the introduction to one of their most influential papers entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, published in September of 2000. And I quote, "From its inception, the project has been concerned with the decline in the strength of America's defenses and in the problems this would create for the exercise of American leadership around the globe, and ultimately for the preservation of peace." End quote. Now, if I could unpack that statement, Salim, it reads to me, now knowing what we know about neoconservatism, that we, the elite, the chosen elect, are determined to use force to shape the world to suit what we know to be best. To that end, we will use the might of the military-industrial complex of the United States to coerce other nations to do our bidding or risk being invaded and having their ruling regimes change. Does that about sum it up, Salim?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, it pretty much sums it up.
So how did this document, first of all, come to be created, and why was it adopted as official foreign policy by the United States?
This document that you're referring to, which was made published publicly or released to the public in September of 2000, um, had a long germinal process that goes back to the early 1990s to 1992. Um, this document was subsequently, very recently, um, referred to by Ray McGovern, who was one of the top CIA analysts and the man responsible for preparing the presidential daily briefing for almost 30 years, um, from the time of Ronald Reagan into the Bill Clinton years. So he's a veteran, and he recently described the document as the Mein Kampf. That's the Mein Kampf of the neocons that eventually became the directive of the American government. Something else I might want to point out right at the outset. These people are preoccupied with, essentially devoted to, foreign policy. It is not about domestic policy, housing policy, urban development, public health, none of that. It is all about America's foreign policy and America's place in the world, and particularly as the period that we're going to be talking about, and we're talking about, as you pointed out, the project for the New American Century, which is 1990s, the project New American Century, that is 2000 and onwards, um, is also in a changing world environment that has taken a dramatic turn at the end or at the beginning of 1990s with the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991. I think that is a benchmark that we need to keep in mind, that people need to keep in mind, because almost 50 years since the end of the Second World War, America led the policy that came to be defined as containment, the containment of the Soviet Union, Soviet communism. that was constructed after the Second World War, constructed after the dropping of the A bomb in Japan. And this policy that was constructed during the Truman years and then carried through by all the subsequent administration, Democrats and Republican, were designed by what you might call the very special elite individuals who served President Franklin Roosevelt during his 4 terms in office, and his New Deal administration, as it came to be defined, through the Depression years and then through the Second World War. And these people, especially the 6 individuals who embodied the elite grouping of the American foreign policy establishment, were known as the wise men, 6 wise men. It's very interesting. And they were the dominant personalities. Let me recall the names from my memory. John McCloy, Robert Lovett, Averell Harriman, Charles Bolin, George Kennan, and Dean Acheson. Of these 6 men, they were all, highly placed individuals, both in terms of their personal background, their origin. They came from notable families like Averell Harriman, who was a son of a railroad magnate in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So they were very wealthy individually, except for one, and that was George Kennan. George Kennan was a Foreign Service officer who rose in the ranks and eventually became deputy ambassador in Moscow during the Second World War and subsequently ambassador. And he headed the policy planning division of the State Department in the years immediately after the Second World War under the Truman administration. So he was a dedicated Foreign Service officer, but the man who originated, in this sense, by his famous X telegram in 1946, that was later on published in Foreign Affairs, the magazine or the journal of the Council for Foreign Relations, and became the foundational ideas and thinking and planning of what became the containment strategy. So George Kennan was the father of containment strategy. But people like Averell Harriman was the ambassador to Moscow during the Franklin Roosevelt's term in office. He was there at Yalta. He was there at Potsdam. He was one of the closest foreign policy advisors of President Roosevelt. Dean Acheson was similarly a very highly placed businessman, lawyer who worked for Roosevelt and then for Truman and became the Secretary of State in Truman's administration after 1948. So these are people, and I'm bringing this out, Robert, for a very important reason. They and their staff, that means the second-tier people who would rise in the department under them, were Americans. And I want to emphasize that. What do you mean by American? Everybody is an American. Yes, but remember we talked about last time about the mass immigration from Eastern Europe. And particularly in that mass immigration from Eastern Europe, where the immigrants of Jewish background. And these were brought into the Democratic Party under Woodrow Wilson through, in some ways, patronship of Louis Brandeis, who was appointed as the Associate Justice for the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson, the first Jew to sit in the Supreme Court. He would be followed by Felix Frankfurter, who was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. So The Jewish Americans, that is Eastern European with their background and origin inside Russia, the Pale of Settlement, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, etc., were recent arrivals, or the arrivals during World War One. Their children and grandchildren will come of age during the Second World War and after the Second World War, and they are the ones, second and third generation, who will become players when you refer to the Project for New American Century, that is the 1990s. But the critical point is that they replace the Americans, like the people I have mentioned, who were what? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were the people who had built America, who had guided America for good or bad, and who represented America's elite in the East Coast particularly. And then they would be replaced gradually but significantly after the Vietnam War into the 1990s. George Kennan would retire, and others would be dead and gone, and a whole new generation of people came. If you keep that in mind, we can keep in mind something that you talked about in the last time in your opening remarks about the noble lie. The noble lie that was at the heart of American politics from the founding father years onward was America was a new experiment in mankind. And this is the age of enlightenment policies that were put in place. Thomas Paine, the great writer, defender, an Englishman who came to America via France and the French Revolution to America, and supported the American Revolution, became a participant in the American Revolution, and wrote some phenomenal books or pamphlets like The Common Sense and The Rights of Man, pointed out that, if it was simply a matter of a change in government through revolution, that is the overthrow of the English crown, English monarchy, and making 13 colonies independent, it would be just another affair, a change in government of no consequence in the larger sense of history. But it was not simply a change of government, it was an entirely new system of government that was designed. And it was designed on the basis of Enlightenment value, which went into the Declaration of Independence and into the Constitution. And we need to keep that in mind. And I would say, as we proceed on this matter, that by the end of the Second World War and beginning of the Cold War years, America had begun to change dramatically from its foundational noble lie, so to speak, myth. It was a commitment to keep America away from the old world, to maintain America's unique system of government that had been established by the founding fathers. And among this critical aspect of that system of government was the separation of powers. It was a representative government and separation of power. The representatives would be in the House and the Senate, representing the people, elected by the people. And similarly, there would be only one office, the office of the chief executive, the president, who would be elected by all Americans through the electoral college system. And the machine was designed that it would be always in a gridlock between the executive and the representative, that's the checks and balance, so that the people would be maximally free and independent. Limited government was the key in that matter. And the Fundamental Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, guaranteed those. And those have to be kept in mind. That was there. And the constant struggle, and therefore the gridlock between the representative of people that is pushing their interests or the interests of selected groups of people in terms of legislation and interests, checked by the president and then by the Supreme Court. Okay, all of that is going to change at the end of the Second World War. America did not have a standing army. America did not have a permanent ruling class, so to speak. America was divided between free men and slave, but that would be, in a sense, resolved with the Civil War and the emancipation. And America began to boom after the Civil War and became a great power. But America was supposed to remain separate, distinct from the old world. And those things were going to change. So when we are looking at PNAC, Project for North America, New American Century, what you find if you just take a glance at the executive summary, the statement that stands out is, at present, the United States, I'm reading from the executive summary. At present, the States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible. America, according to these people now, the new people who have coming in, is in a unique position, and this unique position should be maintained indefinitely, that America is the unipolar power in the world, that any rival that did exist, which was the Soviet Union, has now collapsed. And it is the maintenance of this unique situation will become the goal of the American foreign policy establishment. But first, this noble lie had to be sold, had to be packaged, and the context within it was packaged. That becomes very important to understand.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask you, Salim, was the relevance of this kind of foreign policy and document, given that during the Cold War, of course, it was a bipolar world, Soviet Union and the United States vying for nuclear and military supremacy. And then after the Cold War, it was a unipolar world, prompting documents like this to say, how do we take advantage of the fact that we're now in charge of the entire planet? But now we've evolved to a multipolar world. We have China, militarily advanced and economically now on par in many respects with the United States, and you have Europe and Russia, multipolar, right, and the global South with its own interests. So is a document like this, based on a unipolar world, an American dominance, now relevant given the fact that, one, almost everything in that document has failed and brought death and misery to countless millions of people around the world, and two, it's no longer a unipolar world. Is it relevant?
Well, yes and no. I mean, what you are describing is something you might say objectively we can see happening. Many Americans see it happening. But there is the other side, the flip side of it is that the political establishment, the ruling class, you might say, both in the executive office and in the Congress, are engaged in denying that objective reality and maintaining the noble lie that America is the unique power. America, unique status guarantees, what is the noble lie? Peace, when what we see has been perpetual war since the end of the Second World War. So
It's called Pax Americana in this document.
yes. Pax Americana, that is peace under American power, right? But peace America under American power, as you began in our first discussion, as you pointed out, somewhere between 800 and 900, or 750 and 800 foreign bases that circulates the globe, in which America positions its military capacity in every continent, in most of the strategic places in the world from American point of view, for instance, the Middle East. is one where there has been intense conflict. There has been no Pax Americana. It has been quite the contrary. Did the founding fathers talk about Pax Americana? Was there any such statement anywhere in the documents of the founding fathers and the subsequent administration? What they in fact talked about among the founding fathers was when President Monroe, the sixth president, came around, or the fifth president, sorry, came around, and he put forth what later on came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, that America would exclude the old world from engaging in the new world.
So for that reason alone, you alluded to it earlier when you talked about Americans versus the newcomers from Eastern Europe, Jews mostly, who developed a new foreign policy. Could it be said then that this policy for a new American century is un-American?
Yes, very much so. And that's the discussion we need to have, which we are going to, not based upon what we think. It is what they thought, what they put on paper, where they described their position and then took America in that direction, right from World War One. I mean, the American noble lie or myth was America was going to be different from the old world, with all its entrapments, with all its, dynastic and class cleavages and rule. Uh, Basically, the old world was fragmented between the tyrants and the people. That was the Declaration of Independence. George III was a tyrant, and the 13 colonies were struggling for gaining their independence and their sovereignty from a tyrant. So the old world was a world of tyranny. And people who fled the old world to leave behind the tyranny and engage in the new world in terms of their freedom, their liberty, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. That's the Enlightenment ideas that come forth, and governments will be a sort of contract among the people in terms of their obligations and responsibility and how to maintain their freedom.
There's one thing that struck me reading this document, and that is that it mentions once, maybe twice, something called American principles. Nowhere in the document does it outline what those principles are. It does mention democratic freedoms, whatever they are. Democratic freedoms. You put a word in front of another word, it negates it. They're not freedoms. There's no such thing as democratic freedoms. So, what is glaringly missing from this document is what they're trying to protect. Just American principles, whatever they may be, fill in the blank. So, did you not notice that as well, that maybe the founding fathers talked at length about what makes their nation great? Thomas Paine, for example, writing books on it. And these people don't talk about it. If they ever talk about a principle, it's simply democracy, democracy, democracy. And so they join the Democratic Party, even though, they call themselves neoconservative, but that is an anti-concept. They're not conservative in any way. They're not trying to conserve anything. They're trying to destroy. So did you not find that glaringly omitted from this document, any talk of principles?
Yes, I mean, that is not only right in your face if you read it properly. This takes me back to Leo Strauss, which we mentioned. You read something, but there is a exoteric meaning and then an esoteric meaning. So it is in your face, but you have to read it carefully to find out what is the esoteric meaning. The exoteric meaning is one about democracy. And so America is a democracy. And in that sense, the argument that is being put forward is the American system of government or American idea of democracy is a one which has to be brought about for the rest of the world. And that is, in a sense, the American obligation or American responsibility for America to fulfill. What is missing, or what is never cited, where was this American obligation, American responsibility ever written down? Where was it said by Jefferson that we are a republic? The word democracy was never in play by the founding fathers. We are a republic whose responsibility for our generation and for generations to come will be to take our system of government, our Republican system of government, and plant it in the rest of the world. It was never said that. It was what was understood by the founding fathers and later articulated, as John Quincy Adams articulated it, was that our system of government is a system of government that we will preserve as a beacon for the others to pick up and follow. We've to emulate if they find it of compelling interest. But we will set the example of what it means to be a republican system of government. And we are not going to go, our heart will always be with people around the world who seeks freedom, like we have sought over here to build freedom. But we will never go abroad looking for monsters to destroy. In other words, we can be the beacon of freedom by doing it ourselves and living up to the promise that is embedded in our foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and so on. But we are not going abroad. That was the old world. And that's what we have left behind. So now we are coming almost, 170 plus years later, end of the Second World War, and we find things are beginning to be at the beginning warped, but it is warped that it is not noticeable. And that warping takes place after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, because the question hangs whether Franklin Roosevelt would have gone along with what Truman did under the goading, under the prodding of Winston Churchill. That it would, in fact, if one reads carefully Franklin Roosevelt was not going to be in any way sold by Churchill to any of Churchillian ideas. I mean, it was Churchill. I mean, this is something, again, of historical interest. It was Churchill during the period when America was a neutral power and the war had begun in Europe. That is, I'm talking about 1940, and when Churchill negotiated the Lend-Lease deal with Franklin Roosevelt in your part of the world, when Franklin Roosevelt met Churchill in Newfoundland. And the Lend-Lease was discussed that America would provide Britain with a surplus war equipments, lease them to Britain. Churchill, in his private talks with Roosevelt and in letters that he wrote to Roosevelt, said that he is looking forward to the day when he and Roosevelt, that they together would rule the world. That was the ambition of Churchill, that he and Roosevelt, that is Britain and United States, will rule the world. Because the British Empire was still the largest empire in the world in 1940. The sun never set on the British Empire. And Roosevelt was, on the other hand, how to decolonize the world. Not to put and plant American system of government, but Roosevelt was a businessman. And it was, America is a business in that sense, capitalism. And it was about opening up the world to trade and commerce through which hopefully the rest of the world will develop. Because all of these empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Dutch empires were in Indonesia, or what is called the East Indies, the British Empire, of course, India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc., and many of the African countries that are now free and independent, technically speaking, the Spanish Empire, the French in North Africa, in Indochina, these were all closed by tariff walls, There was no free trade there. There was only free trade within the empire, so to speak. I mean, by the way, Canada, as a country, we talk about free trade, but there's no free trade among our provinces. There are tariff walls. You cannot take beer from one province to the other province, and so on and so forth. So Roosevelt had a different conception going forward. It was the dismantling of the empire, and Roosevelt, as the war went on, and as America got involved after the Pearl Harbor, and as America developed what Roosevelt called being the arsenal of democracy, and supporting Soviet Union with American wealth to fight the Germans, the Nazis, Roosevelt developed the concept and ideas about the United Nations coming together, in which the three great powers, as he visualized after the end of the war, after the defeat of Germany and Japan, would be America, Soviet Union, the biggest land power in Europe, and Britain, as the naval power. But Britain would be the junior player, so to speak, because the empire would be decolonized. And the United Nations would be a condominium of United States, Soviet Union, and Britain holding the rest of the world together fairly, honorably. At least that was the ambition. That's where the charter was created. That's how the process would begin. And the three powers would have to agree on any major changes, globally speaking. Okay, but Roosevelt died. And Churchill prodded Truman into considering that Soviet Union is the enemy. And the Cold War almost began even before the guns of in Europe had stopped shooting. So this change that took place, a lot has to do with personalities and people. So all the people that I mentioned to you in the beginning, the six big names, they were all serving Franklin Roosevelt. They all came of age in terms of their power structure, came of age under Franklin Roosevelt. The new people that would now come together would surround Truman. They would come from the political side, and later on they would replace the people in the executive branch of the government. It is very interesting. Once again, let me take a couple of minutes to lay this out. In the American system of government, the chief executive is surrounded by people that he appoints or he nominates, and then the Congress consent. So it is his staff. The analogy has been made, and I think it is a very powerful analogy. It was made by Samuel Huntington in one of his first books that he wrote, The Soldier and the Statesman. The soldier, in his mind, in some sense, was George Washington. And who was also the statesman, the soldier and the statesman. And what his analogy is that the American president during his term of office is almost like a monarch. He is the monarch unless you remove him through an impeachment, and there's enough vote to impeach the man and remove him. But during his term of office, if you go through the Constitution, he is the commander in chief. He executes the Constitution. He doesn't make the laws. But the people who make the law in the Congress, the Senate, and the House, they cannot execute. They can only provide the funds for the law. And the execution takes place by the executive. And so he appoints it. So he is the monarch, and he is surrounded by his barons, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary, or whatever you have it, the whole cabinet, they are his barons. The analogy is that, say, of King Henry VIII, and then he has his barons, and if he doesn't like the other baron not doing his, he can muse. Where are my barons? Why can't they get rid of this notorious fellow? And then they go out and get rid of him. But they are his barons. They are the ones. The president never appears in the Congress. Nobody can call him to the Congress. It is his barons who go to the Congress for the hearing, and so on and so forth. So he appoints the baron. And those are people who will carry out his directive, his vision, and will serve him. So they don't serve the people. The president serves the people, and he therefore has the people's support. In the case of Roosevelt, he was elected 4 times. He has the people's support to carry out his vision of what it is all about. Okay. And the Congress might fight with him and disagree with him and so on and so forth. That takes place. Well, now with the death of Roosevelt, something that is glacial erupts, and it takes on a dimension. And what is that something? It is the issue of Palestine. It is the issue that begins right then in 1946-47. And it is haunting us right now, 80 years later. Who are the people who makes this issue the number one is a very, again, intricate, complex affair. We can just put it on the table. That's what it is. The barons around President Roosevelt, who were carried on by President Truman as his barons, all told him unanimously that you cannot agree with the partition of Palestine and the recognition of Israel. That is going to put America in a very great set of difficulties. It is not America's interest, and it is not the interest of the American people. So whose interest was it? Well, that we go back to 1915-16, Woodrow Wilson, who brought Brandeis in, who brought America into World War I, who then guaranteed the Balfour Declaration. These people resurface in 46-47, both with the support of Churchill and the people around Churchill. And these are the political people who surfaces. George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, said no. James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of Defense, said no. And all the staff said no to President Truman. But from the back door, the people who had the ear of the president and who was able to approach the president made the president agree. And the question of money changing hand, the question of influence, which money can buy, the question of the 1948 election, which Truman, according to most of the polling data and information, was supposed to lose. All of that comes into play. That is in the Electoral College, and President Truman won. And the key people behind President Trump were the political people who
Truman.
Who brought him the support, who gave him the victory in the battleground states of Northeast America to win the Electoral College vote. And President Truman obliged. He was the one who went along with the partition of Palestine. He went along with giving recognition to Israel 10 minutes after Ben Gurion declared the independence of Israel in May 15th, on May 15, 1948. So we have to keep that in mind. And that's the beginning of the slow process of change in American foreign policy by a handful of people who had the ears of the president. That's in the term that Truman is involved in. Now, who are these people and what they are in? Just to quickly refresh, if you have them a little bit of time, these are the people, East European immigrants, Jews, who are all on the left wing of the Democratic Party. Most of them are basically pro-socialist, pro-communist. The Second World War, they were all behind Stalin because the biggest enemy was Hitler. My enemy's enemy is my friend, you know. They all supported Stalin. And President Roosevelt had very senior members in his government, not in the secretary position, not as barons, but below the rank, who he hired from this class of immigrants. But there was one particular person who was in a very senior position, and that was Henry Morgenthau Jr., who was a friend of President Roosevelt. His father, Henry Morgenthau Sr., was a friend of Woodrow Wilson, and both of them were Jews, or German Jews, you might say, but they were Zionists, you know. And they become very important under Truman administration, that is Henry Morgenthau, and the doors that he opened for people who come forward. Now, these are people on the left. They supported Soviet Union. Wall Street supported Soviet Union. That is the revolution, Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, you know, for their own purpose. And that purpose was that the Bolsheviks and the communists who would become the communists in large measures were Russian Jews or Jews from the Pale of Settlement, you know. And they had bought into the argument of emancipation through socialism, Marxism. Or they were Zionists. They were supporters of the Bund, people like Ben Gurion and others. But in any case, when the World War ended, these people flipped against Soviet Union, even though they were on the left, because they were Trotskyite. And Trotsky had been purged by Stalin. And the issue that brought about the break between Stalin and Trotsky, and the purge of Trotsky, and the entire group of older Bolsheviks around Trotsky was on the issue of world revolution or socialism in one country. This becomes very germane in terms of the noble lie that we are talking about in the period after the Second War, coming into the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. The Trotskyites and Trotsky himself were of the view that there has to be a world revolution, or we have to support the world revolution because Soviet Union is a backward peasant economy. The socialist countries will have the revolution who are advanced industrial economies, you know, with a large working class, the proletariat. The Soviet Union did not have. Old Russia did not have that. So the Russian Revolution was a surprise in the sense that that was not expected to take place according to Marx's vision of history. That was going to happen in Europe, in Germany, maybe, in Britain, maybe. But it didn't happen. It happened in Russia. So the Trotskyite argument was to export the revolution and into advanced country. And the revolution that could have happened or might have happened was crushed in Germany in 1919, 1920. In France, in England, the socialist parties were very large parties, but they had worked their way into the system through electoral politics. And by the time we are talking about, it was the Labour Party in England, which is a socialist party, you know, a working class party, you know, with the background of the Fabians, who had uh, taken over the interests of the working class, and the Democrat Party in America was similarly, a mixed party, not free capitalism, but, supporting welfare state and so on and so forth, Keynesian economics, etc. And the Jews from Eastern Europe were very comfortable with that. And they maintained the view of Trotskyite. They supported Trotskyite argument. Trotsky was dead and gone, but the remnants of Trotskyite idea penetrated and infiltrated into the Democratic Party, And so they were people of the left and they remain on the left. Fast advance into the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement in America, there was a lot of, uncertainties and difficulties and domestic violence, and politics was in a state of upheaval. Assassination of President Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and so on and so forth. And it is in the context of all of this upheaval that is taking place in America in the 1960s, going into the 1970s, these people on the left started questioning what was happening to America, and if America keeps going in this direction, what will happen to their interests. They had brought America to recognize Israel. They had brought America to support Israel. In the June 1967 war, America was fully behind Israel. Lyndon Johnson, became a president, as much a president of Israel as of the United States, something that nobody wants to talk about. His principal biographer never touches, that is Robert Caro, is something that is known below the radar, that Lyndon Johnson was the first Jewish president. This is not discussed in the open. How? Well, on his mother's side, 4 generations of women were Jewish. According to the Talmudic law, a Jew is born of Jewish mother. The line is through the mother. And Lyndon Johnson's own personal history during the New Deal, what he was doing under the radar, which was illegal and unlawful in terms of bundling visas for Jews from Europe trying to find a way out of Europe into the Americas. And that was, under moratorium, just as it was in Canada. Under Prime Minister King, one Jew was one too many coming into Canada. Same was under Franklin Roosevelt. But Lyndon Johnson, with his connections in Texas, was engaged in smuggling. And then immediately after that, in the war before and leading up to the foundation of Israel, the establishment of Israel, the partition, the gun running that Lyndon Johnson carried on. These are all on record, but never discussed. And then during the time after President Kennedy's assassination, there's enough evidence that people can talk about and look into, but it has been sealed and it is a taboo. The role that Johnson played in the assassination of President Kennedy and the subsequent cover-up through the Warren Commission.
There has been just recently, Salim, along that line, the release, I think it was on Alex Jones, of an audio tape where you have 2 prominent Democrats. One was a former president of the Democratic National Committee, talking about how Lyndon Johnson contracted out the life of JFK. So that just came out. I think I watched that yesterday or the day before. Apparently, it has been making the rounds, and Donald Trump has heard it. But I think it was just publicized yesterday on Alex Jones. So yeah, you're right, Lyndon Johnson. Now, I do want to make one mention, though. We talk about East European Jews, and I think it should be incumbent on people to understand what we mean when we talk about East European Jews. And that is that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. People in Quebec vote Liberal because their parents voted Liberal. People in Alberta are conservative because their parents have been conservative. They're brought up in a culture. And when we talk about East European Jews, we're talking about the culture that shaped the people who became neoconservatives. They grew up in families of a particular culture and of a particular area, and they're sympathetic to the grievances that their parents and their grandparents had when they came into the United States. It's not necessarily a religious designation, it is a cultural designation, East European Jew. And of course, like anything else, not all children follow in their parents' footsteps. So I just want to get that out there, that that's what we're talking about. It's a particular culture, a culture of socialism, a culture of victimhood, and that has been passed down generation to generation, and hence we have neoconservative elite are primarily, but not exclusively, of East European Jewish descent. I hope you
Absolutely.
don't mind me clarifying that for people.
Oh, absolutely. It is like, talking about Italians in Canada. Italians in general have voted for the Liberal Party. And today in Canada, people of South Asian background, Indians and so on, they vote for the Liberal Party, particularly in Ontario, or even now in Alberta, in the major cities like um, Calgary and Edmonton. So yes, I mean, people vote for, and it becomes a sort of a in-house gathering. What my parents voted for, what my grandparents voted for, we vote for them along with them, and that becomes identity politics in those terms. Absolutely. The interesting thing that uh, is how is it that East European Jews who became Americans, through the process of immigration, were able to take their view, their ideology, their grievances, their concerns, their historical baggage, as you just defined it, didn't leave it behind in the old world, but brought into the new world. But they're a minority, a very small, minuscule minority. I mean, in today's United States of America, people of Jewish background constitute about 2% of the population, more or less. How's that this 2% of the population ends up almost dominating and controlling American foreign policy? How is it this 2% of Americans have such influence in a 535-member Congress that they can shape and pull and direct how the Congress should vote on issues that are primarily of concern to them and not to the rest of the Americans. So
I
that's
do have to ask that question, Salim. It's interesting that here, this paper that is written on rebuilding American defenses, written by three people. Three people. So there's papers written by think tanks every day. Why would this one, and I think I asked you that at the opening, why would this one get traction? What is it because it's coming from PNAC, who was started by neoconservatives? Um, or is it because it resonated with an American administration at the time looking for a blueprint to move forward?
It is the latter more than the former. It is the latter in the sense there's a fusion that takes place, and that's what we need to understand and grab hold of. And I think you laid down the construct in our last discussion, and I think it, and I keep coming back to it, the noble lie. The noble lie is bought by the people in the Platonic sense, right? And Plato talks about the noble lie. And what Plato talks about, the noble lie, is that the people in general, that is the elect and the people, the shepherd and the sheep, it is the shepherd's task to move the sheep in a certain direction, and the sheep will move in that direction through um, religious beliefs, mythologies, legends that are created, that are constructed. And in that sense, it is a lie. It is a lie, but a lie with a purpose, and that's noble, a good lie, so that the shepherd can drive the sheep in a certain direction. Well, the noble lie of Plato becomes the big lie of Goebbels in the Second World War, or the big lie of the Zionists, Herzl and company. And the more the big lie, or the noble lie, now the big lie, is told over and over again in a fashion that silences any dissenting views and opinions on that matter, becomes, in a sense, the megaphone that drives the people forward. I mean, the Germany that was at the heart of European Enlightenment, in the 18th, 19th century. You mentioned philosophers, you mentioned artists, you mentioned writers, you mentioned poets, and it is Germans who are dominating Europe. And Germany emerges, when it gets united, it emerges as a great power in Europe, you know. And this great power with a great culture and a great past is completely subverted by the big lie that is broadcast, in the rise of Hitler and Hitler's party. So that is the fascinating point of it. How is it people like the six wise men that I mentioned? I mean, the wise men, because they serve the government as their patriotic act. Well, they have their interest in it too. It cannot be separated, but they served America. And how is it that their children and their grandchildren turned completely over to those people who now belong to that 2% of America and bought into their arguments? Well, this is a huge sociological subject matter of transition that happens in the culture itself, the intermarriages, the schools that people go to, the network that is created, and so on and so forth. I'll just hear, since we picked up on this subject before we go on to the public policy side, mention a couple of names that will become very important. These are the baby boomers. These were the people born in the 1940s. And the two names that will become the biggest dominant names in the subsequent years, that is in the 1990s, are Paul Wolfowitz, who becomes the Deputy Secretary of Defense in George W. Bush's administration that comes to office after the 2000 election. And Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Affairs under Ronald Reagan. That is in the period 1981, 1985. But both these people began their journey up the ranks. Remember, they're the sons, and there will be daughters too, but they're the Victoria Nuland, the most famous one that will come around, of immigrant parents or grandparents, their children, who grow up and who go to school in America. Richard Pearl went to school, I believe, in California. I'm not quite sure where Paul Wolfowitz went, but both of them ended up in Princeton, where they did their graduate studies, and in Chicago, where they were students of Louis Strauss. But they began their internship and career in the office of Senator Henry Jackson in the 1960s. During those turbulent years, they were young men. in the 20s, and so on. And Senator Henry Jackson was one of the most prominent senator from the state of Washington. Um, and he would also seek to be the nominee for the Democratic Party in the 1968 election, but he lost. And he would become very important during the 1970s when Richard Nixon would be engaged with the Soviet Union, with Moscow, in negotiating strategic arms limitation talks, that is SALT negotiation, and the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Senator Jackson would become very, very critical player. And both Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl served Senator Jackson on his staff. Now, Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz was brought together and introduced to Senator Jackson by a man named his name was Albert Wohlstetter, and he was one of the chief guns, theoretician and officer in the RAND Corporation, which is the think tank for the military-industrial complex in California. And Richard Pearl came from California. So he brought these two young men together, introduced them to Senator Jackson, and Senator Jackson took them into his staff. So what I'm drawing through the life of these, or through the career of these two individuals, how the network works. Richard Pearl, I believe, ended marrying the daughter of Albert Wohlstetter. Albert Wohlstetter was a mathematician, a strategist, and a very important player in RAND Corporation during the time when the whole issue was about building up nuclear weapons and how nuclear weapons are going to be used in the future warfare. Henry Kissinger was there. Herbert Kahn was there at Hudson Institute. These were the people who were at the top echelon or had reached the top echelon through their networking. Henry Kissinger was brought in by Nelson Rockefeller. He was at Harvard, and Nelson Rockefeller became sort of his mentor. And Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Republican and Republican governor of New York, handed Henry Kissinger to Richard Nixon, introduced him to Richard Nixon to be on Richard Nixon's staff, and Richard Nixon then appointed him as a national security advisor and later on, the Secretary of State. So, he reaches to the top through these connections. This is the network. This is the networking. The 2% of people produced 100 or so names among them, and they married among them in that group. This was the relationship, and this was the network. They were mentored by Louis Strauss, who had become one of the most prominent Jewish political philosopher at Chicago, who had come from Germany, born in 1899, fled from Germany with the rise of Hitler, came on a Rockefeller Foundation scholarship to America, ended up in Chicago, and the rest is history. He became the most prominent. Alan Bloom, who was Louis Strauss's student, would then, mentor all of these people who came forward, people like Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Kagan, and others, and pull them together. So this became a small body of people who then were placed in important position. That's the network. That's going into places like the RAND Corporation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hudson Institute, which then becomes the recruiting arm of the incoming administration at the third and fourth level of government, that is in the department, and they work their way up so that you end up with Henry Kissinger as the Secretary of State or Tony Blinken as the Secretary of State under Biden, and so on and so forth, So, yeah, three people writes it, but it is circulated within that group. And that's the critical thing. And so the point now to remember is the concern which you opened up, that America is falling behind in terms of defense, as the Cold War is ending. Relative to whom? Relative to what? That is not explained. It is simply that America is declining. The defense expenditure is going down. We have to rebuild the American defense expenditure. Well, that's a noble lie. The American public doesn't know. The people of the old guard, and George Kennan was alive. George Kennan died, in the 2000. So he was alive, and his voice was there. As a father of containment policy, George Kennan carried an immense weight in terms of his advice, his position, and what he wrote and what he spoke in the public. And he was saying that it is time for the American people to get the peace dividend with the end of the Cold War. It is time for the American people to turn away from this whole issue of confrontation that had taken place for 50 years, in which America had invested. And the American people get peace dividend, and the Europeans rise up to their own responsibility. In other words, it's time for NATO to come to an end.
In this document, the Rebuilding America's Defenses, they talk favorably about a solid Europe from the Baltics to the Black Sea. And I think that there's echoes of that favorable view of what Europe should look like in the eyes of these elite today with Ukraine. Because what stands between the Baltics and the Black Sea? Ukraine. So I think they have a vision. They had it back in 2000, and it was adopted by the United States and now NATO, I think, because the United States basically is running NATO, that Europe has to be unified from the Baltics to the Black Sea, and this is Eastern Europe mostly. And we're seeing 500,000 deaths as a result of this paper and that vision.
Absolutely. But how is it? I mean, that vision is in 1997, 2000, right? I keep coming back to 1997 because, I mean, as you correctly point out, three people were working on it, or three people are the principal.
Yes, Donald Kagan, Gary Schmidt, and Thomas Donnelly. By the way, Thomas Donnelly now wants to be called Giselle. So they,
So Thomas Donnelly, Donald Kagan, and who was the other one?
Gary Schmidt.
That's right, Gary Schmidt. These were the three principal authors, but the initial draft of it was made in 1992 by Paul Wolfowitz, which is the one that was submitted to Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense for George Herbert Walker Bush, George Bush's father, who became the president. He had served as vice president to Ronald Reagan, and then he got elected in the 1988 election. But he was defeated in 1992 election in a three-way race that split the Republican vote between George Herbert Walker Bush and Ross Perot, who ran a sort of an insurgent campaign. Ironically, looking back at this retrospectively, Ross Perot's insurgency campaign, which was later became part of the Reform Party campaign, which was where Pat Buchanan challenged George Bush in the 1992 campaign, and also subsequently, I think it was the 1996 campaign. George Bush was not there, but I think Pat Buchanan ran. And later on, it was Donald Trump, who was connected with the Reform Party, who decided not to seek Reform Party nomination, but go and get the Republican nomination in 2015, 2016. And Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," goes all the way back to the Reform Party and through Pat Buchanan to Ronald Reagan, "Make America Great Again." It was Ronald Reagan who used that slogan against Jimmy Carter. Um, the point I was driving at is that Ross Perot, unlike George Herbert Walker Bush, was in that sense a man closer to the founding fathers than George Herbert Walker Bush was, because he was concerned about this whole notion, which was under discussion at that time and then became implemented during the Clinton years, of offshoring American manufacturing to China. And Perot was warning against that, and his whole campaign was about that. And he split the vote, what is it? Bill Clinton came through the middle with less than 50% of the popular vote to win the presidency. Here are these certain quirks of history that if it had not taken place, we would have had a different result and we would have been in a different situation. People like Pat Buchanan, another Irish American like John F. K., but on the Republican side, was a patriot, who basically questioned the entire thrust of the Zionist Israeli lobby in American politics, for which he had to pay a heavy personal price that he paid. He lost all his public platform that he was engaged in, and he was deplatformed from everywhere, and he came to be called Paleolithic or conservative, this for saying what he said. One of the things that he said was there are two occupied territories. One is the Congress of the United States, and the other is Palestine, for which he was excoriated. But coming back to the preparation of the document and therefore the shift that takes place, what happens is Dick Cheney was given Paul Wolfowitz's thing, and Dick Cheney wanted it to be redrafted, but then they lost the election. And once they lost the election, they didn't have a place inside the administration. It was Bill Clinton who came in with his body of people. And so these people ended up creating a think tank alongside American Enterprise Institute that you call the Project for New American Century. And from there, they began their argument and engagement. One of the person who was not part of the Project for New American Century, but was possibly as important and influential, if not even more so, was Zbigniew Brzezinski. And his book, which I have right on my hand here, so I'll just pick it up, his book called The Grand Strategy.
The Grand Chessboard.
Chessboard. Was published in 1997, simultaneously as this. And the whole thing is about Russia. Russia has collapsed, and the question is who's going to pick up the pieces. And I'll hold back on that because it takes us right into what you're talking about, the Ukraine war. And that is one of the most decisive issues, apart from the Middle East, that we have to look into, which will be the challenge for Donald Trump as he comes into office next Monday, January 20th. But the point is here that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, in the last week of 1991, the Christmas week of 1991, and was dismantled. And then from the ashes, the new Russia started to emerge, and the old body of the Soviet Union all broke up into independent states like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Belarusia, and so on and so forth. So the whole focus would shift towards Russia, you know. And the question about NATO, will NATO be dismantled or will NATO be given a new lease on life? And this is the interesting hinge point, that while on one side is the debate about the peace dividend, the ruling class, the ruling elite in America do not buy into that. They're still committed to what Eisenhower had warned, keeping the military industrial complex going. And the military industrial complex now need a whole new way to sell its policy. Cold War is over. Who is
As a
just
foot as a
America?
footnote, Salim, I'll mention that Dick Cheney was CEO of Halliburton,
Exactly.
part of the military-industrial complex, big energy, oil and gas corporation.
Right. Right. And what we haven't talked about, and again, time is so limited and the subject is so vast, is the question of resources. You know, I mean, if we go back, it is not simply the issue of Palestine partition and establishment of Israel, and the lobby that emerged and that sold that idea to Truman and brought Truman's victory, and the shakeover and a turnover that begins in the American system uh, is also accompanied at the same time by the question of resources. And the principal resource that the Americans need to take control of, prodded by the British, is the Middle East, with the largest deposit of hydrocarbon fossils, and who is going to take control of that, and who is going to manage it and administer it and profit from it. So in 1952, 53, Truman is gone. Eisenhower comes to office, and what you have is the beginning of regime change. I mean, you're talking about democracy, exporting democracy, something again which is not in the documents of the founding fathers. You have a regime change that is brought about in Iran. And the irony is, Iran has its own version of democracy, which has led to the election of Mossadegh, a politician, a lawyer by profession, a man educated in France at the University of Sorbonne, a charismatic figure in his own right, who is now the prime minister of Iran. And he seeks to nationalize the Iranian oil. It was owned by and managed by, administered by the British and the Dutch, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And it was the Iranian oil, the discovery of oil in the Persian Gulf at the beginning of the century, that's the last century, that under the First Lord of the Admiralty, that is Winston Churchill, the conversion of British naval fleet from coal-fired engine to oil, and so the control of that becomes absolutely important. And it is the Americans, prodded by the British, the CIA under Allen Dulles, brings about a coup d'etat in which Mossadegh is overthrown. The Shah of Iran, who had fled away when Mossadegh got elected, is brought back from Europe to be the king again. And all of that drama is a 25-year-old drama that is played out in Iranian history 25 years later, 26 years later, under Jimmy Carter. The Iranian have their Islamic revolution. The Shah is overthrown, and Ayatollah Khomeini comes back as the leader of Iran, and that's where we are today, where Iran is at the, the target, the crosshair of the Israelis, Netanyahu, wagering that America will join Netanyahu in bringing about regime change in Iran. There have been regime change brought about in this period in Central America, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. So we have entered with the first step taken on Palestine, that was unanimously opposed by the leading officials of the Roosevelt administration in the Truman administration, but they were vetoed. So now we are back. I mean, that is again the background. So the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned against can become very quickly, once again, redundant if people are serious about what John F. K. was assassinated or murdered for, that is, bringing about peace between nuclear power, ending the nuclear power non-proliferation treaty, building down, decolonization, and moving forward. What John F. Kennedy had in his vision, the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress was helping the former colonial countries, colonized countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, helping them through expertise offered through Peace Corps and other, instead of having military outposts, having Peace Corps outposts to help these countries, develop. In my own personal history, as a child, I saw the Peace Corps in my part of the world, at that time in East Pakistan, and my father, my parents, were Peace Corps parents. That means Peace Corps volunteer coming from America, stayed with us in our house, because these volunteers came, and the American embassy, had them billeted. They became family members of selected families in the countries where they were. So in India, in Iran, in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So I, as a child, remember that. I think I shared with you the name of that man, and you identified him, from Missouri, Robert Burns. I still remember, and I followed the process that you went through, and I discovered that Robert Burns had passed away. So, and I'm going back to the 1960s when my dad was alive, and I was not even a teenager then, and I remember Robert. In our home, he spent a year with us. We called him, Bhaiya. Bhaiya means older brother. So that was our term for him, because we have, in our culture, that is the Indian culture, the Arab, you don't call people older than you by their first name. You rank them according to relationship. So older brother. So that aside, what happens is that the Project for New American Century, as you read it, becomes the mind camp, the tool that is offered to the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is too happy to take it. Because also to take it, the military-industrial complex, through their own corporations, are being advised by people of similar background, as I've just told the story of Albert Wallstetter, whose daughter married Richard Pearl. So there you have the network coming together, and that network took up the project for New American Century. And what is the project? To outbid any combination of potential American adversary in terms of military expenditure.
There's a number of core missions that they list in rebuilding America's defenses, and some of them are, well, defending the American homeland. That's a given. They should have stopped there. Fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars. And we're seeing that. We've seen that since this document. They're always involved in all these conflicts. But this one strikes me. perform the constabulary duties associated with shaping the security environment in critical regions. Can you believe that? It says right here they should be the world police.
That's right. That's right. And that experiment began with it goes back a decade, but takes on a life of its own, began during the Cold War years. In fact, it is the last act of the Cold War why Brzezinski is so important. And that last act of the Cold War was when the Iranian Revolution happens in 1979, and one of the major Middle Eastern state then falls out of the control of the Americans, the military-industrial complex, which is what the Shah of Iran was, and goes into the hands of the adversary, so to speak, that is the nationalists, Iranian nationalists under the Ayatollah. Simultaneously at that time, at the end of 1979, the Soviet army goes into Afghanistan, and the argument of the Soviet army going into Afghanistan to Kabul is to defend and protect the existing administration in Kabul. People have seen in recent times pictures being displayed all around of Kabul in 1979 and before 1979, with women wearing mini skirts, cut hairs, and you couldn't distinguish women in Kabul or in the urban centers of Afghanistan or in Iran from women in Paris or women in New York or women in
The
France.
same with Iran. Yes, Iran was very cosmopolitan and modern as well.
Absolutely. So part of the revolution was going back to their own traditional background. In the case of Iran, it was a popular revolution. In the case of Afghanistan, it was not a popular revolution. It was, in fact, a manufactured revolution in the sense of the fundamentalist Afghan tribal people who later on become the Taliban and the various other groups um, have taken umbrage against the modernizing ways of the regime in Kabul under the influence of the Soviet Union, ironically. Why under the? Because if you look at the border and the maps, Soviet Union and Afghanistan share common borders, common interests, and for the longest while, that is going way back into the 19th century, Afghanistan was the buffer state between the British Empire in India and the Russian Empire. And Kabul was a sort of a trading place between the two empires. And the upper class Afghans took as much advantage of going into Russia as they took advantage of coming into India, not only for the trade, but for all sorts of their social and cultural issues. And so there was a long historical relation over there. So by the 1979 that we're talking about, the regime is under threat by this rising forces of religious fundamentalists. And it is not only in Afghanistan. This is a sort of a movement that has a global dimension. Remember, in 1979, there is the Solidarity movement in Poland, which is the rise of the Solidarity under Lex Walesa with a throwback to its Catholic roots against Soviet communism. It is the election of the Pope, John Paul II, who was uh, Cardinal Wojtyla of Krakow in Poland. So the first Polish Pope elected in 1979, who gave immense legitimacy and support to the Polish uprising. So there was the Polish uprising, there was the Iranian Revolution, there was the sense, in 1979, there was the siege of Mecca by what later on people will identify as Al Qaeda. That is, the uprising of the extremist, militant, fundamentalist tribes in Saudi Arabia who were very upset with the existing monarchy because the existing monarchy was not only connected with America, but it was trying to modernize, so to speak, and they were very upset with that, and so they wanted to overthrow the monarchy, and they seized the holy mosque in Kaaba, which is at the heart of Islam, and it took quite a bit of effort with the support of special forces from Pakistan and from France to go into the mosque to uproot the fundamentalists that had taken power there. There was also in India, by the way, and the remnants of them are here in Canada, the Khalistani, who would raise their engagement again under religious fundamentalism and take seize of the Golden Temple in Amritsar, that Mrs. Gandhi then had to engage through police and military to evict them out of their Golden Temple and crush their uprising for a separate state. Well, that led to, many of them coming to Canada and from here, engaging in action, which led to the bombing of the Air India 747 and then the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi. So there was, in a sense, a 50-year cycle of modernization and then the backlash to modernization. But the thing about Afghanistan is, this is what it becomes, it was Carter administration last year in office 79-80, and what Carter administration did under the policy of Brzezinski is to construct a movement in which the fundamentalist forces would be pulled together, armed, financed, and supported in a long war against the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski made it very clear that this was a payback for Vietnam. The Soviet Union had armed and supported the Viet Congs, and now the payback. The Americans are going to do the same thing and make Afghanistan a Vietnam for Soviet Union and basically, bring it down. And that's what happened.
Mhm.
10 years of warfare in Afghanistan where these uncoordinated insurgency became a coordinated, heavily financed, heavily equipped American policy of funding what they call the freedom fighters, mujahideen in Afghanistan, that eventually Gorbachev pulled out of the Soviet Union, but it was so weakened, among many other things, that this was like a domino effect that ultimately Soviet Union collapsed. And what was created to bring about that collapse, the funding and the financing of the Taliban and these fundamentalist extremist Muslims, is now at play for the last 40 years, which is what we might want to save for 9/11 and Iraq and Ukraine and so on and so forth to conclude this matter. But the thing to take away is what began in the seminar rooms of University of Chicago, what began in the dining tables of the first generation East European immigrants, mostly those who were Jews, discussing their connection to Trotsky and what they must do and what they should do, penetrating into the Democratic Party for their own purpose, taking them in. So from the dining tables of immigrant homes to the seminar rooms of Ivy League universities, a group of people came together, a
A
network
network.
was created, and that network then provided the arguments and the ideology in terms of the noble lie. What was the noble lie? Now, let me just, with this, sort of wrap it up. In 1990, Seymour Martin Lipset, one of the well respected, well known Jewish professor um, in one of the Ivy League schools, published the book called American Exceptionalism. And what was American exceptionalism? The hands of God is upon specially elected Americans in critical times. And he pointed out three names. George Washington was providential. Abraham Lincoln was providential, Civil War man who saved America's Union. Franklin Roosevelt was providential, the man who brought America out of depression and saved the world for democracy. American exceptionalism. To present America as an exceptional country, God's elect, was the noble lie under which the other noble lie would be brought in, the noble lie of the chosen people. America is the exceptional state in alliance with the chosen people, and it is America's responsibility to protect the world, to advance democracy, to see to order, and it is under America's hegemony there can be Pax Americana and against nobody and under nobody else. So that is the noble lie that was constructed. And the American people bought it. They bought it out of their own theology, Christian Zionism. The 80 to 100 million Americans in the Bible Belt that became the cannon fodder for the Republican Party in the Nixon years. And ever since, that you cannot win the American presidency with this without the Bible Belt in your pocket. So whether it was Nixon was the first who used that strategy, what was called the Southern strategy, because the Bible Belt was the heart of Confederacy. It was the heart of slavery. It was the heart of Jim Crow laws and KKK. Well, he had to flip them over so that they will vote for the Republican Party. And that was the beginning of the change, where all the leadership moved to the Republican Party. And the Republican Party became, in that sense, the defender of Israel. And that was the 1973 war. And that came Nixon. He raised the nuclear warning to the highest level to supply Israel with weapon system that they were direly in need of, so to speak, to contain the Egyptian thrust into the Sinai and the Syrian thrust in the Golan Heights. These were all occupied territories. And so the Republican Party assumed the thing. And what is so fascinating at the end of the day, that the bulk of American Jews remained Democratic, though the Republican Party started outbidding the Democrats in who is best for Israel. So Trump, in this last election, when he says he's the best friend Israel has, in the 2024 election, barely got 20% of the vote. 80% of the vote went to Biden, despite what he had done with the Abraham Accord and despite whatever he has been committed to doing. That is, as you began to say, people vote for the parents, the grandparents, and so on and so forth. That link remained despite everything. The Democratic Party is the party that is committed to being the party of that 2%. And you can go through it, you can go through the name. That's what the book by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt is about, the Israeli lobby, and other books, like American Theocracy and so on and so forth, about the Christian Zionists and their support, through their theological basis of the second coming of Jesus for Israel. And yet, the Republican Party doesn't get that bulk of the vote.
We see that in Canadian politics too, where a Maxime Bernier, for example, comes along, gets almost a majority of support in the leadership convention because of his really sound policies. And yet today, um, we have everybody voting conservative, even though here's the man who's giving them everything they want as far as sound economic and personal freedom policies. No, voting conservative, voting conservative. That's what I always voted. That's what I'll vote again. It's a bit of a mental illness, I think. It's a bit of a mind virus, to sort of misquote Gad Saad in this particular case. But it's funny that, again, out of the writings of three people rebuilding America's defenses, or just a few people who create this network of neoconservatism, we see it almost like a spider going through all of the political sphere, not just in the United States, but in Canada and Europe. And it has caused so much death and destruction because um, they have dismissed the very founding principles upon which the United States was based, and that is not to go out and seek monsters to destroy. They've sought them, they fought them. In most cases, in many cases, they lost. And it's not a record to be proud of, this neoconservative record. So next time, Salim, in our part three of dealing with neoconservatism, we'll deal with current events, Donald Trump's team, and where we go from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.